Okay, we want to start with Israel and Judah. Around 780 BC, Jeroboam II was king of Israel, and Uzziah, also called Azariah, was king of Judah. And together, if you add Israel and Judah together, it was almost as big as David's had been when he was king over the United Kingdom. So here's what you want to write down. Jeroboam, king in the north, and Uzziah, king in the south. They're kings at the same time. And if you take both of their kingdoms together, they're like the same size as when David was king. So that's like the height of the divided kingdom. That's when they're at their strongest. They have the most territory. It's when they're looking the most impressive. But then comes the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And the first king that we care about in the Neo-Assyrian Empire is named Tiglath-Pilesar, and he comes to power in around 745 BC. So he established a military presence in Syria and then along trade routes, and we have record of him collecting tribute from Menahem, who was one of the kings of Israel. A few years after he became king, Rezin, the king of Syria, partnered with Pekah in Israel to overthrow Menahem's son, Pekahiah, who is now on the throne. And they did it successfully. They were successful, and so they were planning to also overthrow Judah. So just to clarify that, this is what you should write down. So Jeroboam II and Uzziah, kings at the same time. And as you can see, Uzziah is king for a long time, but over in Israel, we have a couple of kings that have really short reigns. Zechariah, king for a very short amount of time. Shallum, king for a short amount of time. Menahem is the guy who paid tribute to Tiglath-Pileser. His son, Pekahiah, king for a short amount of time. And then Pekah, he's the guy who worked together with Rezin, the king of Syria, to take control. And Jotham is briefly king during this time. And then Pekah and Rezin, since they were able to take over Israel, look towards Judah, and they think, ooh, maybe we can take over Judah too. But now Ahaz is king there, and he isn't all about that. So Ahaz was king of Judah, and he did not want to be overthrown. Shocking. So he had a choice. He could listen to God's message through the prophet Isaiah, which said that he should trust in God for help. And we'll talk more about that as we get into Isaiah later on this year. Or he could not trust God, and instead he could go to Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Assyria, for help. Remember, Ahaz, just like Ahab in the north, Ahaz, not a good king, so it should not be surprising what he chooses. Ahaz, faced with a threat from the northern kingdom, decides to go to Assyria for help. God thought this was a bad plan, and he told Ahaz as much through the prophet Isaiah. But Tiglath-Pileser did come to Ahaz's defense, and he beats Pekah and Rezin. So as a result, Hoshea becomes the king of Israel. Most of Israel is taken over by Assyria, but not completely conquered yet. And Judah, under Ahaz, became a vassal to Assyria. So here's what you want to add to your notes. Next to Ahaz, write that he went to Tiglath-Pileser for help instead of God when Pekah was threatening him. And Tiglath-Pileser helped Ahaz take down Pekah. After that, Hoshea became the king of Israel, and Judah became a vassal to Assyria. After Tiglath-Pileser, the next king of Assyria was Shalmaneser V. He reigned for 5 years. And during his time as king, Hoshea tried to rebel. Because remember, at this time, a lot of Israel was taken over by Assyria, so Hoshea thinks, oh, new king comes to power, maybe this is my chance, tries to rebel. But Shalmaneser responds by taking over Samaria, conquering Israel in 722 BC. So here are the notes you want to take. We're going to make a list now of the Assyrian kings that we care about. The first one, Tiglath-Pileser. Important things about him: he collected tribute from Menahem, he attacked Pekah, and he helped Ahaz. And then after him, Shalmaneser V attacked Hoshea and conquered Samaria and the northern kingdom in 722 BC. And you want to circle that date, underline it. It's going to show up on a note card, 722 BC, when Samaria falls to Assyria. After Shalmaneser V, the next king of Assyria is Sargon II, and we don't really care about him. After Sargon II, a guy named Sennacherib becomes king. And Sennacherib attacked Judah in 701 BC when Hezekiah was the king. And this event is recorded on the Sennacherib prism, and we'll be talking about that more in class. But there's a nice picture of the Sennacherib prism in a museum somewhere. So add to your notes underneath Tiglath-Pileser and Shalmaneser V. Sargon II, not important. And Sennacherib, notice the typo there, make sure you have an I, Sennacherib, he attacked Judah when Hezekiah was king. After Sennacherib, his son Esarhaddon became king, and Assyria continues to be very strong through Esarhaddon's reign and when his son Ashurbanipal becomes king. And it's actually when Ashurbanipal was king that Assyria is at its strongest. And that picture there is a relief of Ashurbanipal hunting lions. I don't know, because that exists in the world. Just to show that Ashurbanipal, very strong Assyrian king, and the Assyrian Empire was just kind of at its peak when he was in charge. But after Ashurbanipal, the Assyrian Empire starts to lose power. And once he dies, it's the Neo-Babylonian Empire that rises to prominence. And we're going to see how they interact with Judah later on in class.